We're on Lamed Gimel Lamed Bet by the two dots, the Ein Mimati and the Yantav, still talking about the Hadass and removing the berries. And the ongoing question has been whether there's this issue called Dichoy by mitzvot, whether a mitzvah object, if it was initially unusable when it became originally defined as the mitzvah object, whether that status of being unusable or rejected remains even after it becomes fit again. So until now, we've been avoiding coming to any particular conclusion about that, by the whether there is dichoy or not dichoy. But now we turn to the last clause in the Mishnah, which is you cannot remove the berries on Yontiv. So let's take a look at the Gemara. About 15 lines down in the middle of Lamed Gimel Lamed Bet. Ha'avar v'liktan. So if you transgressed and you actually did pick the berries on Yantiv off of this hadas, so what would be the status? Kasher. It sounds like it would be kosher. It just sounds like you're not allowed to, but that the actual hadas would then become kosher as a result. So the ashra amos, when did it become black? Because as we said yesterday, it's only a problem when the berries are actually black. If they had been black already and the hadas had been invalid before Yantiv began, so dichun me'karahu. So then, at least when Yantiv began, it was pushed away. It was unusable when Yantiv began. Yesterday we tried to claim that it wasn't clear whether that would be a problem. Here you see that it would not be a problem, because even if it was pushed away, not usable when Yantiv began, you could make it usable on Yantiv. I mean, you're not allowed to, but it would become usable. So you should at least be able to infer from that that if it was initially unusable, that's not considered that it doesn't necessarily have to remain that way. Elalav, so okay, as an alternative, we'll try to argue a different possibility. The ashkor biyantov, maybe no, when Yantiv began, they were fine. They just became black over Yantiv, and then you fixed it again. But when Yantiv began, it was okay. So if that's true, nira v'nidchahu, that's a case where it was originally fit when Yantiv began, and then it got pushed away. And then your conclusion would be, shmas mina, then you could infer from that, nira v'nidcha chozer v'nira, that if something was fit and pushed away, it could become fit again. Now, of those two, it's easier to validate the case when it was never fit, right? If something was actually in the category and rejected, right, then it's harder to go ahead and to make it more acceptable, because it was like actively pushed away after it already was fully in that category. If something was like, never fit, even when it became a mitzvah object, more like, it's like, come back and see us when you're ready. So then when it becomes fit, maybe that's different. But so if you had to choose between the two, it's easier to say it's kosher, the case of dichoy me'ikara, than nira v'nidcha. And the Gemara says that one of them has to be okay. Because if you pick the berries on Yantiv, when Yantiv begins, it's in the category of the mitzvah. So either it was never fit and you made it fit, or if it was unfit and you made it fit again. One of those at least is going to be kosher. So the Gemara says, the Gemara says, so let's go back to the first possibility, the ashra meikara. Let's at least concede the less, the more obvious case. It was black when Yantiv began. I'll concede that you can infer from this that something initially pushed away does not have to remain that way. It was black, it was unusable when Yantiv began. It was dichuy meikara, but then you picked the berries, you made it acceptable. That you can infer from the Mishnah. You cannot go so far to infer that fit and then pushed away will become fit again, because that's not necessarily the case. The case was not necessarily that it was fit when Yantiv began. It might have been the case where it was unfit. But minimally, you're right. Since it says don't pick the berries, the implication being that if you pick the berries, it's okay. You're right. Minimally, you could prove that if something was unfit when it began to be a mitzvah, when Yantiv began, that you can go ahead and make it fit. At least you can prove the case of nir v'nidcha. Now, by the way, you could make even a stronger claim. You could say there's no such concept of dichoy by mitzvos, right? That was the question we were asking yesterday, right? Because then, okay, there's no concept of dichoy. Of course you can make it okay. The concept isn't relevant. Here what the Gemara is saying is, even if I were to concede that there is a concept of dichoy by mitzvot, at least we see from this case that the case of dichoy meikara is not a problem. Right? If it was started off being pushed away, then you can go ahead and fix it. It might be dichoy is not an issue at all, right? But at least Dichoy Meikara is not an issue. If it started Yontiv no good, you can fix it once, or you're not allowed to fix it, but if you did fix it when Yontiv began, it became okay. So at least Dichoy Meikara is not a problem. Yes.
So why does the Gemara not entertain the possibility of Hutra? In other words, the whole thing is being compared to Kochim, right?
Yeah.
So, like, there's a concept of Dichui of Kochim.
Right.
Doesn't apply to mitzvah.
Right.
What about the issue of, wasn't that the issue by Kochim of Dichui or Hutra, one of those two?
What do you mean by, oh, that's a different concept of
It's
Dichoy.
a different concept.
Yeah. No. So you're right. I mean, it's the same word, but that's when there's an issue that there's something that overrides that lets you bring it. Like you're overriding it and allowing you to bring it on Shabbos, or overriding it and allowing you to bring it at Betuma. So do you say that it's Hutra or Dechuya?
Right.
So is the prohibition pushed away, or is the prohibition completely allowed, completely released? Here it's whether the mitzvah object is pushed away. So it's a different concept. Here it's more of a stigma, the idea of Dichoy. All right. Okay, so that's the conclusion. The conclusion is that minimally there's not a problem of dichoy meikara, and if you pick the berries on Yontiv, you'll make it okay. Okay, it might be there's no problem of dichoy at all, but minimally there's not that problem. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we turn to the issue about why that you can't pick the berries on Yontiv. Mishur, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon Amru, Mimatin, but Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon says you are allowed to pick the berries. So the Gemara says, how could you do that? You're fixing something on Yontiv. You're making this hadas into a usable hadas. So the Gemara says, you're not trying to fix that hadas. You're picking the berries because you like the berries. You're eating them. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon holds like his father. The Amar Mutar, because his father Rabbi Shimon holds that you can do something on Shabbos or Yontiv if you're not intending for the consequences. You're trying to just eat the berries. You're not trying to fix it. So the Gemara says 1 minute. The Habaye, the Rava, the Ami Tavayo, Abaye and Rava both say, Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Shimon agrees if you cut off its head, won't it die? And it shows you some meaning. You can say, the classic example of Eino Mitkavein is, I can drag a bench across the yard to get it from one end of the yard to the other. Oh, maybe it'll make a furrow? All right, I'm not trying to make a furrow. And you know what? A furrow won't even necessarily be made. It depends how soft the ground is, depends how hard I'm dragging it. So therefore, we could say that if a furrow is made, it's an unintended consequence, and it's not like I did it. But they say, let's say the ground is so soft and the bench is so heavy that there's no question you're going to make a furrow. So you can't say, well, I wasn't intending to make a furrow. I was only intending to drag the bench across. No, since it was a necessary consequence, it's like you intended it. They said, let's say you were to chop off the head of a chicken, and you were saying, I just want to play with the head. I'm not interested in a dead chicken. That was an unintended consequence. You can't say unintended if it'll necessarily happen. So therefore, you cannot use Eino Mitkavein in a case called a psik reshe, a cut off the head, where it's a necessary consequence. So they say if you pluck off the berries, making it a usable hadas is a necessary consequence. It's not maybe it will, maybe it won't. So the fact that you weren't intending it does not get you off the hook, does not make it like it, don't attribute this action to me.
By the way, it's not a necessary consequence.
Why?
Because there could be something else wrong with the leaves.
Okay, but in a case where it is usable, then it's a necessary consequence. And that's got to be the case, because otherwise, that you'd assume that if you did it, it would make it a kosher hadas. So the Gemara says like this. Okay, so the Gemara says, the Islay Hoshana Achriti. You have another hadas. Now, why does that matter? So here you have a fascinating debate of Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi says, and Rashi is like a very simple answer. Rashi says, look, when you look at a hadas without berries, what do you look at it? You say like, oh, now I've got a hadas to use for my lulav. Now I have a fixed hadas. Let's say you already had, let me give you a scenario. Let's say you already had your lulav with the hadas and the arava all bound up and all ready to go, and then you were plucking berries from another hadas. Would you say that you fixed the hadas? No, in that type of a context, you don't look at this hadas as now a fixed hadas. It was just it was just a branch that had berries on it. It was like you had a cluster of grapes that you were picking grapes off of the cluster. In the context where you have another hadas this doesn't transform from being something from being identified as an unusable hadas to a fixed hadas. It only transforms that way when it's needed to be used in that capacity. So that's why Rashi says it's different, okay? It's not like the objective reality now makes it a different object. It was only a different object when it was needed to serve in that type of a capacity. Tosfos says another explanation. Tosfos says that actually, and this becomes very important, it's a principle called psik reisha de lo nichale, which is not explicit in the Gemara, but it's very much developed by Tosfos and other Rishonim. Yes, it's a necessary consequence, but it's not a consequence I'm interested in. And since it's not a consequence you're interested in, it doesn't really be considered to be something that is attributable to you. So if I wanted the furrow in the ground, okay, meaning not like I was trying to make it, but it would be nice for me to have a furrow in the ground, then you say, it was a necessary consequence and it's something you're happy with, you know what, it's like you intended it. But if basically you're not interested in the furrow in the ground and it's not a intended consequence, even if it's necessary, then it can't be like it's sort of like you wanted it. No, I didn't want it. So even if it was necessary, if I wasn't interested in it, don't make it my issue. So that's what Tosa says the case is here. If you're not interested in it, because anyway you've got another hadas, even though you did fix the hadas, we're not disagreeing with that conclusion, it is like you fixed it, but it's not like something that was connected to you, and therefore it can't be pinned on you. Another way Tosfos goes it is here. He even goes so far to call it like it's a malacha shein tzricha legufa. Like yes, you wanted to do it, but not for the normal reason, and therefore you can't be held. It can't be tagged on you. Anyway, that's what Tosfos says. Rashi's explanation seems, at least here, to be a lot more simpler. In this context, where you don't need a hadas, it's not considered like you fixed it. By the way, according to a number of Rishonim, we're only dealing with a rabbinic problem to begin with, right? The idea that's considered like not right. The idea like it's fixing, like making something. If you really are making a vessel, you give the final hammer blow, you shape it, then you make something. That's like an Indian of makah patish or bona. Here, just because now it has the care qualities that you could use it in your lulav, according to some Rishonim, the Rambam, it says even if you did it intentionally, it's not a biblical malacha anyway. So in that context, recognizing that it's a pretty amorphous idea, fixing it to begin with, and you have another one anyway, so you don't really. So in that context, it's not really considered like you did anything of substance. So that's what Rashi says. If you have another one, you didn't really do anything. Which Tosfos says, no, you did it, but since you weren't interested in it, it's not really your problem. It's not really your act. That's how they answer that. Yes.
Are you saying? Did I understand correctly that the distinction of secretion of Dela Nichale is introduced by Tosfos, not the Gemara anyway?
Right. The Gemara has this case and another case like it, which a number of Rishonim say, this is an idea called secretion de lo Nichale, and that's an exclusion. But a number of Rishonim, it's possible to read the cases in the Gemara to be very local reasons and not a generic idea of secret. For us, which because a very dominant halachic category on Shabbos of secretion de lo Nichale is not so clear in the Gemara. Wow. Just so you know, yeah.
So which of these concepts do you apply about the idea of dragging the bench through the ground? Then, if you weren't at all interested, you're not responsible.
So according to Tosfos, if you're not interested in the result, you don't care about the end result. That's psik reisha de lo nichale, which means that it would only be like a rabbinic issue, but you certainly would not be liable. And sometimes we might even say that it would be allowed. That's what Tosfos says. Rashi never says that. Another Rishonim, again, that's how we pass them, like Tosfos. But Rashi and other Rishonim don't agree, and they say that no, this case is special. This case, as opposed to the bench case, you actually did make a furrow. You actually did do something, whether you're interested in it or not. Here, in this context, you didn't do anything significant. So that's how Rashi reads it.
I just looked up. Myrtle berries actually are edible. I've never seen.
There you go. Okay, it sounds like one of those Dr. Which is the Dr. Seuss where they're always eating the berries off. That was like anyway.
Let's see.
That's a different one. What?
If you're completely indifferent, so that's considered lo nichale.
That's the Rishonim don't distinguish between lo nichale and lo ichbas lei. Okay, lo nichas you don't want it, lo ichbas you don't care for it. They basically don't distinguish. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Tana Rabbanan. So we talk. Hutar agdo biyom tov ogdo ki aguda shel yerek. If the knot gets undone on Yantiv, you re-knot it like you make a vegetable bunch, which is like you just wrap it around and you tuck it in, so you don't even like knot it at all because you can't make a knot on Yantiv. So the Gemara says hamani. So the Gemara says like this. Why should you limit yourself to that? Le'an ve'mianav, make it like a bow knot. Make it okay. So the Gemara says, "How many Rabbi Yehuda the Amar Aniva Kshir Mal Yasi?" No, it's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that a bow knot is a real knot on Shabbos and on Yantiv. He says it in another context, and therefore it doesn't make it any good whether you're going to make a double knot or a bow knot. Either way, you can't do it because it'll be a prohibition on Yantiv. So the Gemara says, "No, Rabbi Yehuda. If this was Rabbi Yehuda, Egen Mal Yosabai." You should have to. Then, what good does it do to make like a little tucked in type of a wrap? According to Rabbi Yehuda, you're not yotzei unless you really make a real knot. So it can't be Rabbi Yehuda. He wouldn't let you make any. For him, it wouldn't be good to do anything other than a real knot, and obviously you couldn't do that on Yantiv. So the Gemara says no. This Tana holds like him in one regard, that he doesn't like bow knots on Yantiv, but he disagrees in another regard, and he actually feels that you're yotzei a lulav without doing a full knot. He doesn't hold like Rabbi Yehuda, you really need a knot, going back to the debate lulav tzarech eged, so you could be yotzei this lulav even if the knot got undone. But even if you want to knot it, and lechatchila you should knot it on Yantiv, don't make a bow knot. That, according to him, would be a problem. Now, for Rashi has a very important Rashi here, according to this. If you take a look at Rashi, with Rashi's line, so it's the word alei, 3 lines before the Mishnah of the Rashi, he says the following. But lulav, the ain't tzarech eged. He says a lulav doesn't need a knot, so he'll let you do a tucking in because you don't need to really, because b'diavad you're yotzei even without a knot. Shminin mehacha, says Rashi, we hear from here, to be'inim belulav kesher gamur, sheikshar shnei rashei ha'eged. So meaning, we see, right, it says that according to Rabbi Yehuda, just tucking in would not be enough. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that lulav tzarech eged, you'd have to make a real knot, and you couldn't do it on Yantiv, so you're stuck, right? That's clear, right? That's a good conclusion. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can't make a real knot on Yantiv, number one, and number two, therefore, there's no way to fix this lulav. So from here, so that tells you that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the knot that is demanded by lulav is a real full knot, okay? So, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if you just made it like the vegetable thing, like just wrapping it around, lav egedhu. So that's Rabbi Yehuda, and that's why this lulav is not fixable according to Man Yantiv. So now Rashi makes an important statement. Afilu Rabbana, Rabbi Yehuda, Amri lulav she'eno al good kosher, and even the rabbis that say that if it's not knotted, it's kosher, and therefore here, even though you can't make a real knot, you might as well just tuck it in because even if it's not knotted, it's kosher. Modu de mitzvah la'ogdo. They would still agree that it's a mitzvah to make a full knot. So what Rashi is really saying here, and this is the point I told you yesterday, when the Gemara say the rabbis agree because of Zekeh Liva and Veyu, are they making a purely aesthetic point? Or are they saying that lichatchila you should do what Rabbi Yehuda demands? And what difference does it make? Because from this Gemara we see that what Rabbi Yehuda demands by an eged is not just the reality of physically them being held together, but a fully halachically defined knot, like a double knot. And Rashi here is claiming, so if that's what you get by Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore according to Rabbi Yehuda you couldn't fix this thing on Yantiv, even the rabbis that say, b'diavad it's okay, if you want to do the lichatchila for the rabbis, you need to make a full halachic knot, you need to make a double knot. And that's why there's a real question about those things that everybody uses, those like what I call those accordion boxes type of things, because that isn't a double knot. I mean, it holds it all tight, but it isn't a double knot. So halachically, right, if you put, is that the lichatchila of the rabbis? Would that work according to Rabbi Yehuda? And if it wouldn't work according to Rabbi Yehuda, then at least according to Rashi, who says the rabbis lichatchila don't just want it to look pretty and to be technically held together. They want it to be a real knot. Is that enough? So obviously, the fact that so many people do it, generally of the assumption, either not like Rashi, you don't really need a double knot according to the rabbis, or they hold that if something is held together in a permanent way, that would count even according to Rabbi Yehuda. Even if those holders, even if it would not be a double knot, even Rabbi Yehuda might concede if it's a type of a permanent type of being held. Personally, I wanted to, going back decades now, when I first learned this, decided, okay, but why, it's not so clear that that's the case. Let's really make a real double knot. And anyway, I have to tell you, personally, whenever I use those things, it always like tears off the leaves when you try to pull things in it. So I just get rid of those whole accordion things. And I think I've told you before, take a lulav leaf, I peel a leaf off of the lulav, split it in half, because it's doubled over. Then you've got the one thing, then make like strips. And you take those strips, strips. Those are really like good tensile string. They function as, and they knot very, very easily. And I just make 3 places on the lulav, middle, whatever. First I do the lulav itself, I knot it, but then the hadassah and the rava on it, and I do it with these things, and I do double knots. It holds fine. I think it actually, even aesthetically, I got to tell you, it looks a lot nicer. It looks a lot more natural.
So
You just have the whole thing like there is one big, bundle. Anyway, and then it turned out, I just did this on my own. Then it turned out I married a woman who actually had like some Lubavitch background, and turns out that this is actually Minhag Chabad as well.
Oh, wow.
So it was all bashert. I get the wedding and everything. Yes.
Wait, so 2 questions. So you used 2 terms. You said a bow knot and a double knot. So le'anva me'anav is a
Bow
double
knot. No, it's a bow knot. But the Gemara says that a bow knot. The Gemara's question about a bow knot is: are you allowed to make a bow knot on Yontiv? Rashi's point is, the way Rashi didn't spell out literally double knot, but what Rashi basically, his point is that what you see from the Gemara is that it has to count as a real knot, and in real knot presumably means a real knot that's a knot that would count as a knot for the halachas of Shabbos and Yontiv, because the Gemara assumes that according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no way you could make a knot on Shabbos and Yontiv that would work for the lulav, which means that any knot that works for the lulav would be defined as a knot from Shabbos and Yontiv perspectives. Right. So since lahalacha, a knot for Shabbos and Yontiv is a double knot, the assumption is no. Well, according to Rabbi Yehuda, not right. I mean, Rabbi Yehuda might say yes. But as a general rule, the way we paskin, a knot for Shabbos and Yontiv is a double knot, so that might be the knot that would be required.
Okay.
Right.
And so does that also mean that when you bundle everything together, you don't use like those slip knot things?
Right, so that would be the same question, those slip knot things. So those slip knot things, though, we just tend to put on the actual lulav itself, not to combine the lulav with the other minim. So there's no halacha of eged. Right. The halacha of eged is the lulav with the other minim. So I will use those, but I have to tell you, once I got in the practice of doing this thing of just using it like string, it was a lot easier to just do that for everything.
First of all, they have like a million.
Well, that we'll get to.
And then
okay.
They tie it together.
So hopefully we'll get to that today if we can catch up. Yes.
How do you keep these things moist then? Because
I was wondering that also.
Them out of that folder.
Right.
Actually
so what I do was
a double
right.
thing.
Right. Well, that's a good point. The fact that you could just slip it out shows that they're not really held in any serious way to it. Right. So in theory, I could do that too, because, you could slip it out and then slip it in because it's whatever. But then there's the question, right? Because then you start worrying about things like the earlier Gemara, like Tasev, Elomina, Asui, etc. Now, all of that would only be within Rabbi Yehuda, but then the question is how much do you have to worry about that within the lechatchila of the Rabbanan. So what I basically do is the theory. What I figured out to do, and it works to me totally fine, is I take a nice like a kitchen towel, like a hand towel. I get it nice and wet. I wrap it all in, I wrap it all around, and then I take like some heavy duty tin foil and I put it around that, and it holds like really tight. It keeps all the moisture in, and then I put that in then put the whole lulav in the lulav holder, and it totally stays totally moist.
Yeah, don't take the lulav out.
No. With the lulav, I don't wrap the whole lulav. I wrap the section that has the hadas and arava with a moist, a seriously moist towel. I mean, not so moist that I'm going to squeeze it and it's going to drip at the touch, but anyway. And then I put very heavy duty tin foil around it, and it stays totally fine and holds the moisture.
And that isn't a rabbinic problem for planting in water.
Well, no. It's no.
You don't need a refrigerator.
No, I don't do it with refrigerator.
But topless, the rubbers don't get black.
I always had that problem.
I don't know. It hasn't happened with me. If they do get black, they get black when everybody else's rubbers get black, like towards the middle of Chol Hamoed. Okay.
I always have to replace mine.
Let's take a look. Avava Gezula.
I'm sorry, one last thing. Do you allowed to take, a knot over it? Let's say you have that holder, then that's on the rubbers, and you just take the same knot on the loop. You just put over that. Right?
Yeah, you could do that. Okay. That's also not a double knot. Okay. Arava Gzula v'Yavesha Psula. And Arava, now it's the same mission that we had by Lulav and Hadas, now we have by the Rava. An Arava that is stolen or dried out is invalid. Shalasheva Shalir Nidachas Psula, again, of a Asher worshipped or an Nidachas, which will have to be destroyed and burnt, is invalid. Niktam Rosho Nifitu Aleha, if its head is cut off or its leaves has fallen off. Tziftzfa, now something new, a tziftzfa, which is a certain type of an arava, which we will find out has different types of leaves, and it's a min of a type of an arava that's not kosher, is psula. Kmusha, if the leaves are wilted, v'shenishu mixas, or only some of the leaves have fallen off, v'shel ba'al, and one of the field that is sort of grows by rainfall. Okay, kshera is kosher. Shabal is contrasted often to irrigated, but here it's also contrasted to the idea of arve nachal. Nachal meaning growing by a river. Let's say it doesn't grow by a river; it grows in a field and has to live off of the rainfall. That also is kasher. By the way, a very interesting Rashi. If you look at Rashi on the Mishnah, arva gzula v'yevesha psula, Rashi says lulav dilachem akulu kai. When it says lukaktem lachem, it's not just referring to the lulav and the esrog, but also to the hadas and the arava. The reason that's interesting is, number one, he could have said it by the hadas. I don't know why he waited to say it by the arava. And number two, because the first discussion in the perek was whether the gzula problem is a problem of ownership or is the gzula problem of mitzvah haba be'avera. Here Rashi is dropping the mitzvah haba be'avera and just focusing on the ownership aspect. Okay, let's take a look now at the Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan, Arvei Nachal, willows of the river or of the wadi. Hagdelim al hanachal, that they have to grow by the wadi, okay, which is not exactly the technical requirement, even if they don't grow by a river, but at least lechatchila they should, okay. Davar acher, arvei nachal, she'ala shela mashoch knachal. The leaf is elongated like a river. So that's going to be important because the tziftzifah is a type of an arava that's invalid, which has more circular leaves. Tanya Ida, we taught in the Brisa, Arvei Nachal, Emiel Arvei Nachal. I only know aravas of the river. Shel Baal, those that grow in the field that survive by rainfall. V'shel Harim, and that grows on the mountains. Minayin, where do I know it from? Talmud Lomar, Arvei Nachal mikol makom. The Arvei in Lashon Rabim means even not the paradigmatic Arvei Nachal, but anything of that species, even if it does not grow by the river. The Rishash makes a very lovely point. He says the word Nachal has two meanings. It means a wadi, and it means a river. So he says that's why we're contrasting it to two cases. One is growing in the field, which is not by a river, and the other is growing on a mountain, which is not in a wadi. So it doesn't need to be Arvei Nachal either way. It doesn't have to be a wadi, and it doesn't have to be by a river. Either way, it's okay if it's the same min, if it's the same type of plant wherever it grows.
Is there a preference? Does the Torah says Arvei Nachal?
Some say there's a discussion about is there a lechatchila of Arvei Nachal. Rashi says that there is. If you look at Rashi, Arvei Nachal, the first Rashi on the Gemara, mitzvah b'zo. Okay, that's why Rashi makes it sound like there's a lechatchila. There's some debate if there's a lechatchila to get them that grow by the river. Abu Shol Omer, top of Lamadal and Lamadal Aleph, Abu Shol says, Arvei Shtayim. Arvei is Lashon Rabim, 2. Achas l'lulav, achas l'mikdash. To tell you that there's an arava for the lulav, and there's another type of an arava that you need, what they would have.
He has just one arava in his lulav.
We'll talk about. Hold on, I'll talk about that in a minute. But the double language is to tell you there are two separate mitzvahs of arava. There's a mitzvah of arava that you do in the lulav that we obviously know, and then there's another mitzvah of arava that you do separate from the lulav, which is the one they did in the base of Mikdash, the walking around the altar, which we'll hear about later. So that's what the double language says for him. Rabbanan, the rabbis would say, L'mikdash minalahu. Where did they get the idea that there's this separate mitzvah of that they did in the base of Mikdash of walking around the altar with an arava? All right, they don't get it from a pasuk. That's just a tradition. A halach l'Moshe miSinai. Damer Rabbi Yasi Rabbi Yochanan. Asara nitiyot, the 10 plantings. Arava v'nisu chamayim, the arava that they would do in the base of Mikdash, walking around the altar, and the pouring of water. Halach l'Moshe miSinai. Those are all halach l'Moshe miSinai. Now, the last two are easy. The arava, we know that what we do, sort of like with the hushanas, we do it with the lulav. But anyway, they did it in the base of Mikdash with the arava. We'll find out more about that. The walking around the arava, around the altar. Nisu chamayim is the special thing. That's why we have Simchas Beis HaShoev on Sukkot, a special pouring of water that they did with the morning sacrifice in the base of Mikdash over Sukkot. The only time they would ever pour water on the altar. The 10 plantings is an unrelated point. It is the idea that on a Shemitah year, you stop working the land already Erev Shemitah. Already, the period before Shemitah. Some types of things you stop working from the Pesach, like 6 months before the Shemitah years begins. Some areas you stop working from Shavuot, whatever, 4 months or so before Pesach begins. But if you have trees, you can work the area underneath the trees, like right, up to like within a month before the Shemitah year begins. Now, let's say you actually have. Hold on, let me just check Rashi for a second. See what I'm doing. Wait a minute. Right. So here's basically the halacha. If you have old trees, you can work the area directly under these old trees, which sort of need a lot of nutrients and irrigation until a month before Rosh Hashanah. But if you have young trees, you can actually work them right up until Rosh Hashanah and a year before your Shemitah year, even though there's generally a mitzvah to add to the Shemitah year. If you have 10 trees in a field that is 50 by 50 amot, and they're sort of dispersed equally within that field, you're allowed to work not just directly under the trees, but you're allowed to irrigate and work the entire field for the sake of those young trees all the way up to Rosh Hashanah itself. You don't have to add anything on to Shemitah in that scenario. So that's the special halacha of 10 young trees. 10 young trees dispersed equally in a field of 50 by 50 amot, you can work the whole field. Whereas if it was more than 10, or they weren't dispersed equally, or the field was larger, these types of things, you could only work under the trees, you couldn't work the entire field. Okay, so we're not going to worry about that. The only interesting thing to point out is, why are these three bunched together? There's a lot of things that are halach l'Moshe Misinai. So Rashi says, well, these happen to all be discussed at the same time in the base medrash, so that's why they were bunched together. But probably they're also bunched together because they're not the same question, but they all do relate to water. Right, exactly. So presumably the water connection is what brings them all together. The same. So anyway, but that's the basic point. We know the idea of arava from halach l'Moshe Misinai. We don't know it from the verse. Now, by the way, Tosfos asks an interesting question. Tosfos says, if you take a look at Tosfos says like this: Rabbanan lemikdash minalahu. Tosfos on Lamed Aleph. He says, Hachanami mati lemipai labashol shabab shel hari minale. Says so Abashol, who learned that the arve is one for the Beis Hamikdash. Where does he know the idea that you can use them even if they don't grow by a river? So he says, Vishema Leisle. Maybe he holds that if they don't grow by a river, it's invalid, because he needs the word arve to tell you the one that's used for the Beis Hamikdash. And then he says, Ulufi says about 6 lines down, Sarich li zaher shalolito arav lulav ela im kain gedela al hanachal. Maybe we should say that you can only use an arava, not like the Gemara says, only if it really grows by a river. Why? Because later we're going to say the double language of arve is going to tell you 2, because how many aravas do you have on a lulav? 2. So if later we say the double language of arve says you need 2 aravas, maybe we can't include the other type of an arava that doesn't grow literally by a river. So Tosfos has a possibility that you would need to have aravas that grow by a river to be yotzei. If we're used right, not because of Abishal, but if we're going to later say the double language is to demand 2 aravas, so maybe it's not coming to include those that don't grow by a river. We don't paskin that way. That would be a really nice big chumrah, but that is a possibility because of the drasha, the way the Gemara learns it out. Okay, back to the Gemara. No, Tana Rabbanan. Arve nachal hagdelos al hanachal. So meaning those that grow by the river. Now we just got through saying it doesn't have to, other than Tosfos, literally grow by a river, but at least it's the species that grows by the river. So to exclude the tziftzifah species that generally grows in the mountains. Now of course, we just said a minute ago, you can use an arava that grows in the mountains. Fine, but it's the species that is the classic species that grows by the river, as opposed to a tziftzifah, which is a different species that fundamentally grows in the mountains. So it's not a question of practically where this thing grew, but what type of a species it is.
So even if you
correct. It doesn't matter where it grew. Amar Rabbi Zera, Mikra. Where do you see a verse that tziftzifah is considered a less quality type of an arava, and therefore should be like a downgraded type of an arava? Kacha mayim rabim. Take on many waters. Tziftzifah samo, you have made it into a tziftzifah. So this is a verse that is like in the context of a curse of the Jewish people, and it says the way it's going to be read, which the Gemara will say in a minute, is it used to be a type of a plant that would be on all these waters, and now it has become a tziftzifah. So you see, a tziftzifah is a lesser plant that does not generally grow by the waters. So Amalei Abaye, so Abaye said, "V'dilma perushe kamefarish." How do you know that it's sort of downgrading it? Maybe it's just explaining it. My Kacha mayim rabim, take that thing that grows by many waters. Umayniu, what is that? Tziftzifah. So maybe tziftzifah is a type of a thing that grows by many waters. Maybe it's on a lesser type of a plant. So it says no. In kain mai samo. What does it mean? It has made them into a tziftzifah, or made it into a tziftzifah. That means it used to be a better type of a plant that grew by waters. It has now become a tziftzifah. So you see that a tziftzifah is a lesser, and it's not the type of species that generally grows by water, and therefore it is not considered good for an arava wherever it grows. Amar Rabbi Avo, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and now we're going to explain what the metaphor of the verse. I said the Jewish people should be before me like that which is taken by many waters, that which grows by the waters. Umayni or rava, that's a rava. Probably there's also a play on the word of kach, like ulakachtem lachem, right? It's taken for the mitzvah. They passled themselves. They made themselves like the tziftzifah that grows in the mountains, and they made themselves something that could not be taken for the mitzvah. They sort of pushed themselves out of this holy context. Now, some say this is just going to be a repeat, but rather than sort of having it as Rabbi Zera quoting the verse to explain why a tziftzifah is no good, that the verse was already embedded in the Braita. And that the Braita itself said that you can't use a tziftzifah, and it quoted the verse. Maskif la Rabbi Zera. Now Rabbi Zera, rather than quoting the verse, asked on the verse. Maybe tziftzifah is the name of that thing that grows on many waters. Maybe it's not a lesser type of a plant. No. In kain my sama, then what would sama mean? Sama means it's being downgraded. Amar Rabbi Avo, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ani amarti k'yisrael lefanik k'chach mayim rabim, umayni arava, ve'ein samuatzman k'tziftzifah shebaharim. And so it's basically a complete repeat, except it starts with having that verse in the Braita, rather than having Rabbi Zera to be the one to quote the verse. So now we have said that because of that verse, we see that tziftzifah is not the kach, is not the thing that is taken for the lulav, is not the thing that's al mayim rabim. It's fundamentally a different species, and therefore the actual arava doesn't have to grow by the river. The tziftzifah, no matter where it grows, is a different lesser species and is no good. And that's our psak, that of course an arava is good even if it does not grow by the river, except according to Tosfos that wants to make it an issue, because if we use the pasuk to tell us that you need two aravas, Tosfos wants to sort of resurface that as a problem, but the general assumption is it does not have to grow by a river. Now that we've said that's the difference, how do you identify the difference between a tziftzifah and an arava? Let's take a look. Tanu Rabbanan, Ezu arava ve'ezu tziftzifah. So what's an arava? What's a tziftzifah? Arava, kaneshala edom. It has a red twig, and if you look actually at aravot, some of them actually, not all of them. I'll talk about it in a minute. Well, it might be that it starts red and then it turns color, but anyway, it has a red twig. The Allah shala mashoch, and the leaf is elongated, as we mentioned before. That's also part of the suggestion of the word arav nachal. Upia chalak, and the edges of the leaf are smooth. Tziftzifah, the tziftzifah is different in all three ways. Kanashala lavan, it has a white stick. Va'alashala agol, and it's a circular leaf. Upia domel lamagal, and the edges of the leaf is like a scythe. It's serrated. So that's what, and of course it said three qualities that make it an arava, and the three opposite qualities make it a tziftzifah. Let's say it has only some of the qualities of the arava, right? So if you take a look, Tosfos interprets this very leniently. Tosfos says kaneshala. Tosfos says kivan de pirish simanei arava. If once it said the three characters of an arava, have a sagi. It could have ended there. These are the three characters of a rava. Anything that doesn't have these three is invalid. The reason it says the three opposite qualities are in the tziftzifah is to tell you don't need all three to be in a rava. Only if it has the three bad qualities is it not good. Okay, that so you don't need all three good qualities to be good. So it's quite interesting, right? The Gemara often does that. It describes both extremes and leaves you wondering what's the story in the case in the middle. So Tosfos actually interprets it very leniently. It's only a problem if it has all three negative qualities. Okay, again, interesting question, because sometimes you will get an arava, A, that doesn't have a red stick, although sometimes it might have been red, but it just turns color. But B, you will get an arava that sometimes the leaves, as you know, there's some aravas that are much longer leaves, and there's some that are more roundish leaves. Also difference in hadassim, some are longer and some are much rounder. Okay, so which of you need all these qualities or some of them? Again, not clear. Tosos basically comes out very leniently that you only need some of them. I'm not poskening here. So now the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says Vatanya. So now we said if it has a, what do you call it? If it's got a scythe-like leaf, the edges are no good. So the Gemara says, V'atanya doma l'magal kasher. 1 minute, we have a brayta that says that even if the leaf is like a scythe, it's kosher. Even with the serrate, it's doma l'meser pasul. If it's like a knife or like a saw, it's invalid. What's the difference? The difference is that a scythe, all of the serrations go in one direction, like they're angled things. Whereas a knife, it's sort of shaped like this, right? It doesn't look like this. Right, that's one type of thing. So it cuts in either way you move, right? That's as opposed to serrations that go like this, right? Where it only cuts if you're moving in one direction as opposed to in the other direction. Okay, so if it's got edges on both sides, if it's more triangular like a saw, it's no good. Whereas if it's like a scythe and it's only serrations in one direction,
double edge, meaning on one and the other, meaning the view of your knife.
Yeah.
It depends. You can have it on both sides. You know what I'm saying?
Oh no, yeah. That's not what it's talking about. It's not talking about both. It's talking about Okay, so anyway, the Gemara says like this. So which is it? If it's like a magal, is it kosher or pasul? So the Gemara says, Amar Abaye, Kitan Yehi Bechil Fagila. That thing that is, when it's like a magal, it's kosher, is a different type of a species called a chilfagila. Okay, which is so if you take a look at Rashi, he says like this, 3 lines down in the wide lines, Chilfagila min aravak sheirahi, upia domel magal, aval shar arava piha chalak. So Rashi basically says, and this is reinforcing, or this is based where Tosos gets his point from, there are some species of arava that do have leaves that are serrated, that are kosher, right? So there are species, so meaning not all species, when we said if it's serrated like a scythe, it's invalid, that's not a universally true. There are some species that it's serrated like a scythe is invalid, and there's some species like this chilfagila that it's serrated like a scythe that it is valid. Okay, now how do you know which is which? You have to know your species of a rava. Okay, but that's basically Tosas's point. The way Tosa seems to want to read it is that it only if it has all 3 problems is it invalid. So presumably chilfagila, while it might be serrated like a scythe, the other qualities it has are the classic arava qualities, and therefore it is good. Okay, so that's the conclusion of the Gemara. Is this type of a serration bad or good? Sometimes it's a bad species. Sometimes it's a good species. There's a species called chilfagila which actually is okay. How do you know? Is not very clear. According to Tosos, the answer might be, as I said, because some of the other characteristics it has are the good characteristics. Yes, Michael.
So when you said that, I want to understand one thing about it. I said a bowl is something that doesn't need to be irrigated, but so it means if you have a field that you do irrigate, and it needs to be irrigated, then you couldn't use anything that grew there.
No.
Right?
No. Baal is here in contrast to growing by the river. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's rainwater or irrigated or river. It's just contrasting it to something that grows by the river. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this: Amar Abaye, says Abaye, who just got through saying that it's chilfagila. Since we have to identify a certain type of an arava that has serrations, that's good. So, and I've identified it as chilfagila, then we can infer that chilfagila is good for the arava. So the Gemara says, by the way, quite interesting here, because here it uses the word hoshana to refer to the arava, and if you remember before, it used the word hoshana to refer to the hadassim, which are cut for it, right? So the Gemara said, actually it was a similar statement, right? It said before, when you cut the hadassim, it says, right? That was Gemara way back on Lamed Amud Aleph. It says, where was it? Hizavitu asa, and then it says hashda hoshana may cut. Here it's called a hoshana. And yesterday as well, it spoke about when Abaye said you hear that this type of thing is kosher for a lulav. He said it was the same Abaye. Shma mina hai asa mitzra kosher lahoshana. So hoshana seems to be the word for anything that's part of the bundle together with the lulav, not just the hadas, not just the rava, but the bundling together with the lulav is called the hoshana. So this arava is kosher. This chilfagila is a species that's kosher to use for the lulav. Pshita, obviously, No, Mao de Tema, I might have thought, Hoel v'Islay Shem Levi, same point as before, since it's got some type of a descriptive name associated with it. It's not just straight arava, it's the Chilfa Gila arava. So Shem Levi, Lo Niskasher, won't be kosher, Kamash Mulan that it is. Ve'ema hachanami. Now, maybe we should say that. No, Arvei Nachal Amar Rachmana Mikol Makom. Arvei Nachal is not, again, classic only arava. Arvei in the plural means anything that's one of the subspecies of arava. Again, not a tzivtzifa. That's seen as, again, completely unrelated because it's not like of the type that normally grows by a nachal. That identifies it as fundamentally out of the Arvei Nachal category. But if it's within the Arvei Nachal, even if it's not the paradigmatic species, any one of the species of Arvei Nachal is sufficient. Okay. Amar Rav Chisda, said Rav Chisda, Hani klas mili ishtanu shamayu mikarav Beis HaMikdash. The following three things, the names reversed from the time the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Chilfasa aravasa, arvasa chilfasa. The things that we used to call arava, we now call chilfasa. It's not chilfa gila, which is actually kosher, but chilfasa used to be the name of invalid aravas, like the tziftzifa, and aravas were the names of kosher. Things that we now call chilfasa used to be called aravas, and vice versa. So if you wanted to know what's a kosher arava nowadays, you would go around and ask, what are things that we're calling chilfasas? Because we're now calling chilfasas things that used to be called aravas, and vice versa. My nafkamina lelulav. For the lulav, that if you want to identify the kosher species of arava, now those are things that go by the name chilfasa. Okay. Now shifura chatzotzarta shipura. Shofar is now called chatzotzeret, which is a trumpet, and things that used to be called a trumpet are now called a shofar. So my nafkamina l'shofar Rosh Hashanah. So you should know that if you're looking for a shofar Rosh Hashanah, don't go around saying I'd like a shofar. They'll give you a trumpet. You need to go around saying I want a chotzotzeret, and then you'll get a shofar. Now, by the way, Rashi says, well, I mean, what is a trumpet? Normally, that would imply like a man-made metal object. Mm-hmm. So then, like, do I really need them to tell me don't use that for a shofar? Well, okay, maybe you do. Rashi says that no. The difference is that a chatzotzeret suggests one that's like a simple straight one, as opposed to a shofar suggests a more like bent type of a thing, and therefore you're supposed to use a bent shofar for Rosh Hashanah, not one that's just straight. By the way, interestingly, the Sheiltos, which is a Gaonic work in the mitzvah to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, says "D'mechayvin de Beit Yisrael lemitka b'chatzotzarta." Okay, that we're obligated to blow a chatzotzeret because this is reflecting the fact that the language had shifted and the word chatzotzeret meant shofar.
Rashi knew what he was talking.
Well, no, Rashi's point is that what did chatzotzeret used to mean, or what does shofar now mean? Does it now mean like a metal trumpet, or does it mean an animal thing just straight as opposed to twisted? But the Gemara does indicate that the words had reversed. Okay, now. Patorta, patora, patora, patorta. These are two different words for different types of like tables, and one was big and one was small, and which was which, the names changed. L'may nafkamina, what difference does it make to know what's called what? That if you agree to sell or buy a table, you got to know which type of table you're talking about. Okay. Amar Bai, so Bai said, Afani Omer, now that we're talking about things that names reverse, I'll add to the list. Beikase hovlila, hovlila beikase. So these are different types of inner organs in an animal. Beikosis and hovlila, I don't know how they translated it, whatever, it's a part of the stomach. Wonderful. L'may nafkamina, l'machar nimtza ba'ovei beit hakosod. If you have a needle inside the walls of one of these organs, so there's a difference between which organ it is, and you have to know which of the organs we're talking about. I am not going to...
That says one's the first chamber and another
is the second.
Fine, it's an issue of David. I am not going to unpack that now. We'll have enough. We'll worry about that enough when we get to Chulin. Amar Bar Yosef. Afani Omer. I'll add to this list. Bavel Borsif. Borsif Bavel. What used to be called Bavel is now called Borsif, and what used to be called Borsif is now called Bavel. L'may nafshim. You know what difference does it make? L'gidei nashim. Forget. Now, what does that mean? So it could mean, you would think it means, when you have to put somebody where somebody comes from, and they come from Bavel, so don't get it confused. Know that what used to be called Bavel is now Borsif, etc. Tosa says, Rashi says that can't be what it means because we don't put countries in the get, we only put cities, and Bavel's a country. So Tosas and Rashi both say the nafkamin is for the first Mishnah in Gittin, where it says says that when you come from Eretz Yisrael, you don't have to say b'fanei nechtam. When you come from Chutz La'aretz, you do. If a shaliach is bringing a get to testify that it was written and signed correctly, and the Gemara says when you come from Bavel, you also do not have to say b'fanei nechtam. So you should know that exclusion of Bavel from that halacha applies to the area now referred to as Borsif, not the area that used to be referred to as that, which is the area that used to be referred to as Bavel. Okay, let's move on.
Actually, Babylon, the city, was abandoned by the time of the Gemara.
Okay, let's take a look at the Mishnah. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Shlosha Hadasi. Now that we mentioned the lulav, hadas, and a rava, before we get to the esrog, we're going to talk about the group of the lulav, hadas, and a rava that all get grouped together. So let's take a look. Shlosha hadasim, you need 3 hadasim, b'shtei aravos, 2 aravos, lulav echad, esrog echad, 1 lulav, 1 esrog, which is exactly what we do. But then he adds an interesting line. Afilu shnaim ketumim v'echadenu katum. Of those 3 hadasim, 2 can have their heads cut off. 2 and only 1 has to be perfect. Which the Gemara says, like, make up your mind. If you need 3, they all have to be good. If you need 1, if you only need 1, then why do you? If 2 can have their heads cut off, either they should all be good with their heads cut off, or none of them good. What's the split that 2 is okay and 1 not? Okay, we'll worry about that. Rabbi Tarfon Omer, afilu shloshim ketumim. Rabbi Tarfon says all 3 can have their heads cut off, which is interesting, because why all of a sudden are we debating this issue of hadas by their heads cut off and not by a rava? Rashi says that according to Rabbi Tarfon, he doesn't need hadar, but if you look at the last Rashi in the Mishnah, delo by hadar hadas. He doesn't need hadar by hadas, which is bizarre. Like why the hadas doesn't need a hadar and the lulav and the arava do. So the whole idea that you could have a hadas katum and there should be a separate halacha by the hadas, by this idea of katum, you could have said maybe the hadas doesn't become unhadar with the head cut off. It's a bigger problem by the lulav and harava just in terms of what aesthetic reality is created. But to say in principle you don't need hadar, why the hadas should be excluded is bizarre. So on the one hand, you have this issue about whether you need, about the hadas, whether it can be katum or not katum. But the other issue is how many of each that you need. Rabbi Akiva says, Kushem shalulav echad ve'esrog echad, kach hadas echad ve'arava echad. There's 1 lulav, 1 esrog, 1 hadas, 1 arava. It sounds like it says, like, 1 God, 1 Torah, 1 Jewish people. Now, I should say that I don't mean that only in joke, because there's a quite shocking midrash, according to Rabbi Akiva, that describes the symbolism of the Arba Minim, and he describes each one of the Arba Minim is Kineged HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he quotes a pasuk: "Lulav zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Esrog zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hadas zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu," which really evokes this almost very, Kabbalistic idea of bringing together, like somehow the different aspects of the divine, and sort of seeing that as what the whole idea of the lulav is. So there's actually a midrash that Rabbi Akiva says that, and therefore combining that with the idea that Rabbi Akiva says only 1 lulav, 1 hadas, 1 arava, one wonders if there's some correspondence there. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Tanya, we turn to the Brisa. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Priyetz Hadar, Achat, Kapot Marim, Achat, Anaf Eitzavot, Shlosha, Arvei Nachal, Shtayim. Now, where's he getting it from? So if he's getting Anaf Eitzavot from the fact that there's 3 words, and Arvei Nachal from the fact that there's 2 words, or the word Arvei is in plural, so why not learn Priyetz Hadar 3 esrogim, Kapot Marim 2? So it's not exactly clear, but Tosfos raises the question. Not exactly clear. Obviously, the last do seem to be by the number of words, or arvei by the plural, but how that you're limited to 1 lulav and 1 esrog is not so clear.
How do you get more? I mean, some people take more hadasim.
We'll talk about that later. So, arvei nachal shtayim. Vafilu shnayim ketumim, even if 2 of the hadasim are cut off, the tips are cut off, echad she'eino katum, and 1 is not. Rabbi Tarfon Omer, Shlosha 3, Vafilu shloshtam ketumim, all 3 can have their heads cut off. Rabbi Akiva mekashem shalulav echad ve'esrog echad, kachadas echad ve'arava achas. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, Yochye esrog imahem ba'aguda achat. Now it's interesting why Amru lo, because who's he disagreeing with? But anyway, maybe the esrog should be bound up together with the lulav, hadas, and arava in 1 bound. Marta, the chinemar priyetz hadar v'kapot marim. It doesn't say a priyetz hadar and kapot marim. V'lolo nemar ela kapot priyetz hadar. Then there's no vav. Kapot marim ve'anaf eitzavot ve'arvei nachal. So the fact that the esrog is not joined to the lulav with a vav shows that you bunch the lulav with a hadas and a rava, and you keep the esrog separate. How do you know that they prevent you from one or the other? Meaning, if you don't have all 4 minim, you're not yotze. How do you know that? Talmud Lomar, ulakachtem, you shall take them. It really means you shall take for you, but shetehei l'kicha tama. The Drash is ulakach tam. It should be a full taking. You have to take all of them together. You cannot just take a few and be yotze. It's actually interesting because you can take them at different times. You can pick up the lulav, then pick up the hadas, then pick up the arava, then pick up the esrog, and you're yotze. But what we learned from ulakachtem is you're not yotze unless you take all four of them. Okay? Now,
I'm not going to Rabbi Yehuda, who says it needs an egg, right?
Right. Okay. Rabbi Yishmael Manavshach. Now, what's this Rabbi Yishmael idea of two heads cut off and one not? Each shleimim by, if you need them to be whole, by namikulu, all should be whole. Ilo by shleimim, if you don't need whole, afilu chad namilo, then they should all three be able to be cut. So Amar Bira, Amar Rabbi Ami, Chazabar Rabbi Yishmael. All right, he reversed himself. So which one did he reverse himself from? So Rashi says he reversed himself from the requirement of three. And really, he winds up really saying, really, bottom line, I really only need one. And therefore, two of them can have their heads cut. So I really don't need three. Again, it's strange. It does not sound like that. It sounds like Rabbi Shmuel feels like one is core and the other two are sort of like necessary but not as central. But the Gemara can't understand how that all works together. I'm Rabbi Yudam Shmuel. Halacha Rabbi Tarfon. We rule like Rabbi Tarfon that says all three can have their heads cut off, which is interesting. The Azar Shmuel l'taimei, he goes according to his reasoning. The Amar Shmuel Lahanu de Mizavni Asa. Shmuel said to people that sell the Hadassim, you'd better lower your prices and sell at a reasonable price. Low, and if you start hiking up your prices, I will expound the position of Rebbe Tarfon, and I will say that you can use them with their heads cut off, and therefore there goes your whole market, because now people won't pay a premium to get full hadassin. So you'd better sell them at a reasonable price. So the Gemara says, my time now, why is he threatening to teach them Rebbe Tarfon? If it's because Rebbe Tarfon is a lenient position, the leader should look Rebbe Akiva to make Kotfei. Why not say Rebbe Akiva, who only demands one? So why? So the Gemara says no. Because it's much easier to get three with their heads cut off, and to get one perfect is harder. So actually, it would make it much easier for people to demand three if you could allow katum than demand just one. So if he really wants to threaten them, the bigger threat is to tell you can use them ketumim, even three ketumim. Now, by the way, the Gemara, Tozo says, what do you mean, threaten him this way, threaten him that way? If you paskin like Rebbe Tarfon, you're only going to threaten them with what you paskin like, not with what you don't paskin like.
Yeah,
okay?
I didn't know that.
So that's what the Gemara is sort of saying. Like the Gemara is trying to say, I'll prove to you he holds like Rebbe Tarfon. Because if he was just threatening them and he didn't really hold like it, he should have threatened them with Rebbe Akiva's position. And the Gemara says, that's not a proof. Because maybe Rebbe Tarfon is a more threatening position than Rebbe Akiva's position. But anyway, the conclusion is that Shmuel holds like Rebbe Tarfon. And again, it's a fascinating point. If we paskin that way, why is it that the hadas could be katum and other things don't have to be ketumim and can't be ketumim? Is it like Rashi says, fundamentally you don't need hadar? Why should hadas have a different fundamental demand of hadar than other things? So one is the interesting issue of ketumim, but the other is the fascinating question of the numbers, where you get the numbers, and the idea that Rabbi Akiva says only one of each, and he doesn't agree with this issue of numbers. Tomorrow maybe I'll touch on the issue that Michael raised, which is what if you have more than the minimum? Is that an issue or not? That comes up in the Rishon, and we'll touch on that tomorrow. Okay.
So, Rabbi, I still don't understand about this.